All these things Jesus said to them in parables, and without a parable he did not speak to the multitudes. But privately to his own disciples he expounded all things. We've been studying the parables the last several weeks. Last week we looked at a kingdom parable that I admitted I misfiled, and I'll go ahead and tie this one with it because it's another kingdom parable, actually from the chapter of kingdom parables, Matthew 13. And it is another, like last week, it is a parable that is often misunderstood, and we're gonna get to the bottom of it and see what Jesus was actually trying to say. Just a reminder, parables were virtually the most common mode of teaching among the Jews, and Jesus was no exception to that, but his were unique in a way from the way that the Jews normally used them. Normally, they would be simple illustrations for something that had already been taught. But with Jesus, they served as a foundation for a teaching. So the parable was first, in other words, and then he would explain it to those who asked, who would seek and knock. And usually, as we see in the New Testament, that was his disciples that did that. So he wanted his audience to ask, seek, and knock. And basically, when he would say things like, "He that has ears, let him hear," was almost an invitation for them to come and ask for its hidden meaning. And this morning, we're going to look at another kingdom parable from Matthew 13. It is another of the ones of parables of Jesus that are frequently referenced. It's known as the parable of the tares and the wheat, or the parable of the tares or the weeds, or it's another one of those that's actually named in the scriptures, in the text, not by the Lord himself, but by his disciples. They called it the parable of the weeds of the field. So that's what I'm going to call it. The parable of the weeds of the field, or the tares of the field. It is, like we said, it is a kingdom parable, but it is a little bit different. It's slightly different than some of the other kingdom parables, and we'll see that unique characteristic as we look. But let's start by just looking at the parable again, refreshing our memory. Ron just read it, but we'll read it again. It says, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, 'Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?' He said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' So the servants said to him, 'Then do you want us to go and gather them?' But he said, 'No. Lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, gather up first the weeds and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" This is a parable. We have to maybe put it together with the parables that he has just said. He has just told in the context. We sort of have rearranged them a little bit. He's just told the parable of the soils, or the sower and the seed. Now he tells this parable, and then he tells some other parables. He tells the parable of right after this, he tells the parable of the mustard seed, the parable of the leaven. And then we read the statement about how he didn't say anything to the multitudes, hardly, without a parable. But then we read that when he left the multitudes, his disciples came to him and they had a question. They got into the house where Jesus was staying and they said, "Tell us about the parable of the weeds of the field. Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." It's interesting, isn't it, how he in between after the parable of that we're looking at this morning, he told two more parables. But when they got to the house, they didn't ask about those. They had the other parable on their minds. They had the parable of the weeds on their minds. And that's what they asked. Explain to us the parable of the weeds, that one you told. Not so much the mustard seed. That wasn't heavy on their minds. Not that they didn't care about it, but it wasn't on their minds. Not the parable of the leaven. Tell us, explain what that one meant, the one about the weeds. And it is a parable that does have several elements. And maybe a good time to mention that in theory, it wouldn't necessarily be smart to just assume that we should even consider the elements of a parable, because it is sometimes could be dangerous, and it has been proven dangerous. But here's the thing. On some of the occasions, the Lord himself told us about the elements. And he said, this thing means this, and this thing represents this. So since Jesus did that that means sometimes we might have to do that too. So Jesus thought that it was a good thing to explain some of these elements, but that's not to say that every single element has to mean something. And we'll also see in this parable, sometimes they're elastic, and sometimes two different things can represent the same thing, or a thing that doesn't really is not the focus. This is one of those parables that has several different elements. Thankfully, Jesus tells us some of them. He tells us what some of them mean. Even if he doesn't tell us all of them, he does tell us several of them. So here's what Jesus said. Here's what we can put together of what he told us. They said, explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. And this is what Jesus said. Number one, he said, the man, the householder, is the Son of Man. Son of Man was Jesus' favorite way, his preferred way to refer to himself. That's what he usually called himself. Other people referred to him in different ways. Some people called him the Son of David. Sometimes he was referred to as the Son of God. Jesus referred to himself, and by the way, other people referred to him as the Son of the Carpenter. But Jesus referred to himself most often as the Son of Man. So when Jesus says, this man who sowed good seed in his field is the Son of Man, he means, that's me, is what he's saying. That's me. So the man is Jesus. And this is what I will say is the most important part of this parable. What's next? I'll just go ahead and say this parable is used often to teach some things that Scripture elsewhere does not agree with. We have to use the rest of the New Testament sometimes to help understand other parts of the New Testament. And so there may be times where we don't know exactly what something exactly means, but we can come to a conclusion by eliminating some things that we know it can't mean. Well, let me just say, this is what so many people believe. Just like with the laborers in the vineyard, and how people see that they were all paid the same at the end, and so they automatically say, see, here's the parable's teaching that no matter when you become a Christian, we all get the same reward, when that's not what Jesus was talking about in that parable. Well, in this parable, people say what this means is that we have no right to judge anybody else in the church, in the kingdom, and that God will take care of it in the end. Right? Because there's wheat and weeds, and you're not supposed to pull up the weeds, because the parable says, in the parable, Jesus said, no, don't do that. But in the end, God will take care of that. But that's where this comes into play. What Jesus explicitly tells us about the field is not that the field is the kingdom. The field, he says, is the world. Therefore, this is why I believe this is the most important thing about the parable. Jesus explicitly tells us that the field in the parable is not the church, it's the world. And this shows us, or reminds us, that sometimes in the kingdom parables, the kingdom is represented as a specific thing in the parable, like the mustard seed. The kingdom in the parable of the mustard seed is the mustard seed, and it grows. The kingdom in the parable of the net is the net. The kingdom here in the parable of the weeds of the field is not the field. It's the field is the world. And so in this parable, it's not that the kingdom is specifically represented by one of the elements, but the kingdom, this whole scenario describes something about the kingdom. So this whole picture explains and describes something about the kingdom, and that's what Jesus is telling us. But note this for now. The field is the world, he says, right there in the explanation. What about the wheat? Well, the wheat, he says, are the sons of the kingdom, or what we might call believers. The seed, even, are the sons of the kingdom. The good seed are the sons of the kingdom. Not the word, like the parable he told before this one, but the good seed are the sons of the kingdom. The wheat are the sons of the kingdom, believers. Well, what about weeds then? The weeds are non-believers, unbelievers, evil, you might say. But then he brings up the servants, and this is where I say sometimes things have some crossover. Because the servants, who are the servants then? If the wheat are the believers, then who are the servants? Well, we could say it's the same thing in a way, or at least related. They're the disciples. Maybe they're the apostles specifically, the ones who are asking about this parable. But at any rate, we don't need to push every single thing too much. He says, then the harvest. There's a harvest coming. That's the day of judgment. In the end, when the harvest comes, he says, we missed one. The enemy is the evil one. The devil is always, the evil one is always the devil in Jesus' teachings. The reapers are angels. The gathering is exactly what Jesus talked about in Matthew 25. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, he's going to gather together all nations, and they will separate the sheep from the goats. Well, here, the angels, the reapers are coming and gathering. They're separating the wheat from the weeds. And the weeds would be thrown into the fire, and the wheat would be gathered into his barn. It's very similar to the parable he told after this explanation, which was the parable of the net, where the net is cast into the sea, it's drawn on the shore, the good and the bad are separated, and then the good are gathered into vessels, and the bad are thrown into the fire. The difference is, in this parable, the world is in view. Not the church, but the world, and by extension, the church maybe. Note some things here. Who are these sons of the devil? He says the weeds are the sons of the evil one, the sons of the devil. Who is that? Who would you say are sons of the devil? Well, I'll tell you who most of us would probably say is, the most wicked people, the most evil people, the people who harm children, or the people who murder people or hurt people violently or viciously or maliciously. They're the most evil, the most extreme. But that's not necessarily the case. We learn elsewhere that at the end of the day, there are only two groups of people. There are only two classes, two groups. There are those who belong to God, and there are those who belong to the devil. There's no third group. Jesus himself said, whoever is not with me is against me. Whoever doesn't gather with me scatters what I'm trying to gather. There are only two groups of people in the world. Always has been. Those who belong to God and those who belong to the devil. 1 John 5:18-19 makes this distinction. John said, everyone who has been born of God doesn't keep on sinning. And then he said, we know that we are from God, and the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. See, the whole world it belongs to the devil. That's why Jesus elsewhere called him, he's the prince of this world, because he's got the world. The world is his in a way. In another way, the world is God's, because he owns it. And that's what is in view in this parable. The field belongs to him. The world is his, and everything in it. What are the weeds, though, in the parable? The Greek word that's used for weeds there is a word that it's pretty much unanimously conceded that it is a poisonous plant. It's a poisonous plant. It harms the rest of the plants, and it'll definitely harm you if you eat it. Has been said to produce violent nausea, convulsions, diarrhea, and there were times when it ended in death. Not a good thing. It was a poisonous plant. And so that's what the evil one sowed in the field here. That is the world. And what's interesting is, at least early on, it looks exactly like wheat. Looks so similar. Now, when it gets ripe, you can, I guess the trained eye can tell the difference. But when it's green, you can't really tell them apart. Very hard, very difficult. And that does have a role in the parable where they asked, do you want us to tear up the weeds? You want us to tear up the weeds? Tear them out of the ground. And he said no. Well, again, the key to this parable is in what he says the field is in verse 38. It's the world. Jesus, in other words, is not saying here that we are to ignore sinful and impenitent people in the church. That is what this parable is often used to teach. The age-old idea that you are not to judge anybody else, you leave that to God. You're not the judge, God's the judge, so you leave it to God. If there's sin in the church, who are you? You're not perfect either. You ignore that, you turn somewhere else, you look away, God will take care of it in the end. That is not what Jesus is teaching in this parable. First of all, we know that it can't be so because Jesus elsewhere taught that we are to do that. He said to judge others, judge your brothers and sisters, but judge them with righteous judgment. Judge them with right judgment. Judge them without hypocrisy, he said in Matthew 7, 1 and following. Don't judge hypocritically, but judge yourself first. Then you can worry about your brother. In John 7:24, judge with righteous judgment. In 1 Corinthians 5, 2 Thessalonians 3, and Titus 3, Paul said that we are to disfellowship those who are impenitent and in sin in the church. So this parable has absolutely nothing to do with church discipline. So what does it mean? Well, it means this. There will always be good and evil people in the world. It's just a fact. Now, since there will always be good and evil people in the world, as we learned from the parable of the net, there will also be good and evil people in the church. But that's not what he's talking about in this parable, because the field is the world. There will always be good and evil people in the world, and it is not man's job to eradicate evil people from the world. To pluck up those weeds is to kill them. You're plucking them out of the field, which is the world. So plucking up evil people from the world is not what man is supposed to do. Instead, Jesus told his disciples later, and before for that matter, our job is to teach them. We teach them. If we want to eradicate evil from the world, we do it with the gospel, not with the sword of steel, but with the sword of the Spirit, the Word. That's how we eradicate evil. Jesus told them, go out, preach the gospel to the whole creation. You know, he told them in that Great Commission that those who believe and are baptized will be saved. But you know what he didn't tell them necessarily is, okay, well, what about those who don't? Well, he said they'll be condemned. But, okay, what do we do about them? What do we do with them? According to Mark 6:11, we looked at it a second ago in our Bible study, shake off the dust from your feet, move on. Don't kill them. In other words, what are you supposed to do about those who don't believe the gospel and obey? Nothing. Leave them to God. You see, that's the application there. You don't do anything. When the time comes, God will eradicate evil. He will take care of evil people who refuse to obey the gospel. 2 Timothy 2:19, Paul said, the Lord knows those who are his. He knows. We may not be able to tell the difference sometimes. And there's the significance of they look a lot alike. Hard to tell the difference. You might accidentally pluck up some wheat when you try to pull up the weeds. Well, didn't Jesus tell us that there is a way that we can know the difference? Didn't he say, by their fruits, you'll know them by their fruits? Which, sure. But sometimes you can't tell. And you know what? There's another element here that maybe we don't think about very often when it comes to the eradication of evil from the world, is time. We don't know, we can't see the future, can we? There may be somebody that, as of right now, is a weed. But we don't know, in 10 years' time, they may not be a weed anymore. They may not be. They've rejected the gospel now, but they may, if given the time, they may receive it. And if I pluck them up, I've robbed them of that chance. God, however, can see it. He can see it all. He can see time. He can see the past. He can see the future. And in the end, he knows the difference. He knows those who are his. So he is the one most qualified to deal with the separation of the good and the evil. Our job, as we've seen in other parables so far, is always the same. Preach the gospel. Teach. Don't go out and try to kill them, but try to convert them. So what are some lessons we learned? That's one of them. Number one, believers are not authorized to remove unbelievers from the world, literally speaking. Now that may sound like an obvious thing to us, to you. That may be like, surely that's not what he's teaching because everybody knows that. Well, I don't think they do. There are some religious groups that actually do believe that they are to remove unbelievers or those whom they perceive to be unbelievers from the world. Islam, to name one. Not all of them do that, but their book tells them to. So if they start doing what their book tells them to, more of them will do that. It's the fastest growing religion in the world. Maybe because of this. They do this. They either harm or ultimately even kill those who refuse to become Muslims because their book tells them to. Smite them at the neck, wherever you find them. Unless it's during the holy month. But even if it's in the holy month, we'll give you a pass if you have to kill one in the holy month. That's what their book would tell them to do. Jesus teaches the exact opposite. Our job is not to kill them, but to convert them. And the irony is, you'll still accomplish the same goal, won't you? You can remove the evil person from the world, or you can remove the evil from the person in the world. And you've still removed the evil by converting them. But if they refuse to be converted, we're to leave them to God. That's what Jesus says in this parable. He says, no, let them grow together. Let them be. God will take care of it in the end. Now, as far as in the church goes, totally different story. Jesus said, if a brother has sinned against you, you go to him and you tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he still doesn't listen, you take somebody with you, one or two. If he still doesn't listen, you take him to the church. If he still doesn't listen, you kick him out of the church. That's what Jesus said. Paul said the same thing. 2 Thessalonians 3:6 and 14. He said somebody who stirs up division. So he says somebody who walks disorderly in 2 Thessalonians 3. He says somebody who stirs up division, you withdraw from them as well in Titus 3. So it's not true that Jesus taught that we're to ignore everybody else's sin in the church and pretend like it's not happening and everything's okay and let God deal with it in the end. When you really think about it, that's one of the most unloving and cruel things a person could ever do. Because what you're doing is letting them go through the rest of their life believing that they're fine, and they're going to find out from God in the end that they weren't fine. That's supposed to be the loving thing to do, as opposed to telling them beforehand that their life is not right with God, that they need to repent. That is hardly Christian love, but telling them. There's another element to this that we sort of skipped over. I would say it's more of a side note that is not the main thing that Jesus is trying to focus on, but it is significant. When did the enemy come and sow weeds among the wheat? Did you notice? He said it was while men were sleeping, while men slept. Now, in the parable itself, I don't think Jesus meant to teach anything there. I think it was just one of those things that was the most ideal time for this to happen. At nighttime, everybody's asleep. They're not out in the field, so we'll go in the field. But based on other things that we learn about the devil in the New Testament, there is a lesson to be learned here. The devil builds his army among God's people when we become spiritually sluggish. When we're sleeping spiritually, the devil's strengthening. That's when he can come in and sow seeds of discouragement, discord, and so on and so forth. When we slack off on preaching the gospel to the whole creation, Satan has an open playing field. Just think about a sport, whether you're on the court or you're on the ice or you're in the field or whatever sport it is, and one of the teams just sits on the sideline for a whole quarter or a whole half or whatever. It's going to be an ugly game for that team. The other teams out there, they can do whatever they want. Goal after goal after goal after goal, no opposition whatsoever. When we do that spiritually, when we're not out on the battlefield for good, for God's cause, the devil's got an open playing field to do whatever he wants. While men slept. It doesn't say while the man slept. It says while men slept. Or some versions say while his men slept. While his people were sleeping. When we become sluggish in desiring and defending the truth, the devil's going to find his way even into the body of Christ. But especially in the world. And therefore, Peter said in 1 Peter 5:8, right after he said the devil is like a roaring lion prowling around seeking somebody to devour, he said, therefore, be sober and be vigilant. Keep on your guard. Be vigilant. Be proactive. Stay busy with the work of God. Because there are people out there who need to hear the gospel. They need to hear the truth. They need to receive the truth. But as for what to do with them after, that's not our concern. Don't kill them. You know, John and James, the sons of Zebedee, when a village of Samaria rejected Jesus, wouldn't let him stay there, they had this idea. They said, Lord, you want us to call down fire from heaven and burn this village to the ground? And Jesus said, no, I don't want you to do that at all. Let's just go to the next village. Isn't that a lot more reasonable? Yeah, they rejected Jesus in a direct way. Jesus said, you don't worry about that. I don't need you to do that. I can handle it. And that's what he's saying in this parable. The job is the same. It's not our job to remove evil people from the world. God will take care of that in the end. He knows those who are his, and that means he knows those who are not. So what about us? What's our application? What's our takeaway? Well, am I doing what God does want me to do? Am I actually going and trying to reach lost souls to convert them into saved souls? Or am I just leaving them to God? Because I don't need to leave them to God. I need to try to reach them first. Just like Paul did in the synagogue everywhere he went. And maybe they opposed him and reviled him. And in that case, like we looked at in Acts 18, he said, fine, I'll leave you alone now, but I'm innocent of your blood. And I'll go preach to somebody else. I'll go try to convert somebody else. That's what we're to do. But first we have to make sure we're doing it. We're actually trying to reach lost souls. Before we can do that, though, we need to make sure that we are following the word. Have I obeyed the gospel? Before I can even think about trying to convert somebody else, I need to make sure I'm converted.